you've played in VR, you don't need me to tell you how fun it is. You already know. It's great, it's fantastic. It does have its problems though. Whether it be screen resolution, field of view, tracking issues, or problems with different types of locomotion that we see in different games. You might recognise most of these problems as being hardware issues, and these are things that we expect to see ironed out in future generations of headset just as a consequence of the technology industry moving forwards over time. But the problem out of this list that you can't address solely with hardware is the locomotion problem. Before I talk about anything else in this video, it's worthwhile me just talking about my history with motion sickness. And that's because it's going to colour my impression of VR as a whole, and whether you're more or less prone to it than I am is going to change your experience with VR relative to mine. I think like a lot of people, I used to suffer with motion sickness when I was a child, particularly when I was sat in the back of cars and on buses and things like that. But as I've grown older, I've grown out of it, and it's not been something that I've had to really deal with in my day-to-day life at all in recent memory. So that's worth keeping in mind as you continue to watch the video. Another thing that's worth keeping in mind is that all VR police spaces are different. And mine has a very small tracking dead zone just in one very particular corner, and it's things like this that VR game developers have to sort of factor in and work around when they're creating games. Locomotion in VR was always going to be a problem, and that was evident from the very first demos we played on the prototype headsets like the DK1. The Tuscany Villa demo was notorious for causing motion sickness with people, and people online had a variety of different theories about why this demo caused motion sickness, and there was truth in all of them, more or less. The most acknowledged problems with this demo tended to be things like screen refresh rate, which was a problem on the DK1 since it only had a 60Hz refresh rate on the panel, whereas modern headsets actually refresh at 90Hz, and even these aren't ideal yet. Another issue that was identified was screen persistence, which was relatively high on the panels used in the DK1 compared to what we have now, and would cause smearing on the screen when players turned in the virtual world, and this would cause motion sickness. You might recognise both of these as hardware issues though, and these are things that you expect to see ironed out over time with new generations of the product when they're released. One of the problems that you can't fix with hardware revisions though is locomotion. The type of locomotion that was used in the Tuscany Villa demo is what we usually refer to as free locomotion, and is very comparable to the sort of movement mechanics you'll see in ordinary first-person games. And it made a lot of people motion sick, and as a consequence of that, a lot of people think that free locomotion actually causes motion sickness, and this isn't necessarily true. A common term that you'll see online is VR rules, and this is a list of do's and don'ts in VR game development. Things like don't take the control of the head movement away from the player because it can make them sick. What people don't acknowledge a lot of the time when they're talking about this is that these rules are tentative and pretty prone to change. A great example of the tentative nature of these VR rules is highlighted really well in this PC Gamer article that I'll actually put the link to in the description in case anyone wants to read it in full. And it's about a series of games called Anshar Wars. In Anshar Wars, the player controls a little miniature spaceship with the movement of their head. When the developers sent the game to John Carmack and the rest of the team at Oculus, none of them wanted to play the game as they felt that this particular mechanic would actually cause motion sickness. John Carmack tested the game regardless and found that it didn't actually make him motion sick, and when the rest of the team tried it, none of them felt any discomfort playing the game either. The reason I mention this is because you have to keep in mind that a lot of these things are really tentative to change. So if someone tells you that free locomotion causes motion sickness, you shouldn't take their word for it. If you look back at some of the old Reddit polls about how many people seem to get motion sick using the DK1 and DK2 headsets, you get figures like, 3/4 of people, and this clearly isn't the case anymore with the current generation of headsets. There is a certain stigma in the VR community that a lot of games that don't have fully free locomotion are probably going to be worse than those that do. And in my experience, this just simply isn't true. Many games can be designed solely around the idea of very limited locomotion, and it can actually play into the gameplay pretty well. And if you look at certain game genres, it's a better fit perhaps. Perhaps if you're playing a puzzle game, standing experiences with very limited locomotion make a lot of sense, but it can also make sense for shooter games. So an example of that would probably be Super Hot VR, or maybe the upcoming Arctica 1 from the same devs as Metro Last Light, where you sort of teleport around to different set pieces to handle a certain amount of enemies in an environment with a piece of cover that you're given. And because the devs know exactly where you're going to be stood for each sort of enemy encounter, they can design the level around what cover you need, where the enemies can come from, where objects are placed in the world and things like that very compellingly. That's not to say that there are issues with some games that have standing locomotion that are sort of cover based. You can have a look at the game that's on screen right now. It's called Dead and Buried. It has a variety of different modes. It's a multiplayer western cover-based shooter, for the lack of a better term. One of the modes is a 1v1 duel thing, which is absolutely fantastic, and I go back and play it every time I play VR for at least 20 minutes. It's great fun. However, one of the modes which developers seem to focus on more in the promotional material is this shootout mode, which is a 2v2 sort of team deathmatch style game. And each time you spawn, the game actually puts you out in the open more times than not, with the cover to the side. The problem is the actual cover can be outside of your play space, and the developers haven't done a good job in sort of recognising that and developing the levels around players that have smaller, more sort of average, I would say, play spaces like mine that are about 6 by 8 feet, which means sometimes you can't reach the cover and it puts you at an immediate disadvantage against people that can. This element of the actual game design is why Dead and Buried can sometimes fall flat, where games like Super Hot and probably Arctica 1 when it releases soon will excel. And that's because Super Hot and Arctica 1 look to place most of the cover and things that you need within the centre of the play space rather than on the periphery, which is a good idea for VR game design when you're trying to deal with people that have different size and different shape play spaces. Not all teleportation is born equal though. Whereas some games have fixed nodes for player locations, others allow for freely teleporting to wherever the player pleases. Robo Recall does this excellently, giving players creative freedom to kill moany robots in a plethora of cathartic ways. The arc teleportation used allows players to decide which direction to land facing, as well as plan ahead and reorient themselves thanks to the bullet time to pull off moves I'd only dream of managing as a kid. The user controlling the landing direction of the teleport has the additional advantage of keeping the player from having to turn around and get wrapped up in the headset cable too. Budget Cuts allows players to bounce their teleportation destination around corners and preview the location before they commit to teleporting, enhancing player control of the situation and making badass stealth takedowns easy as pie. And Doom VFR looks wondrous, using a similar but distinct dash teleport system to carry forward the frenetic energy and momentum needed for Doom. Satisfyingly gore-killing demons by charging into them looks amazing. But then you have games like Skyrim VR. Oh, Skyrim. We went longing for this teleportation-riddled existence. RPG exploration needs to be continuous and organic, not a series of scenes like teleportation presents us with. Admittedly, this is a hardware problem with the PS Move controllers, since they don't have any directional inputs, but perhaps that means the game should be saved until the controllers do? In reality, teleport movement is used for more than just motion sickness aversion. It's often used to further game mechanics, or rarely because it is the de facto solution demanded by the hardware. Regardless, internet denizens will likely hold strong and absolute opinions about teleportation in VR for the foreseeable future. Normal first-person movement. Nice and standardized and all very familiar for gamers, right? Left stick to move, right stick to turn. That was my reasoning before I tried VR, and it turns out I wasn't quite right. There are numerous extra degrees of freedom in VR that aren't dealt with in traditional first-person gaming. Decoupled hand, leg and head movement is a biggie that's really easy to overlook from the outside looking in. Say you're playing Battlefield on a gamepad. The left stick controls the direction the character is moving relative to where the player model's body is facing. In VR, should the left stick do the same? Or should it follow the player's head? Or should it follow the player's hands? The answer to this question depends on the game. Slow-paced tactical shooter Onward has a noteworthy solution to free locomotion. The player's initial input on the left stick is the reference direction, which is maintained regardless of where the player's head or hands are facing. This means that if I start by walking forwards, and then turn 90 degrees to the right and want to move that way, I actually need to hold right on the analog stick, despite the fact that my character model would then be moving forwards. To reset the reference direction, all I have to do is simply let go of the analog stick and input another command, This is arguably the best solution out of the bunch when also considering movement relative to the head and hands, as it allows for strafing, and for the player to aim and constantly re-aim his gun in a fight without accidentally moving somewhere they didn't want to. First-person endless runner games may opt to use head relative movement, whilst games in which you control a vehicle such as a jetpack may use hand relative movement. Because of this, for the first time in a long time, I often find myself needing several minutes to fully understand the movement system in a new VR game, when it's never been a problem for me in first-person games on my monitor. Onward also ties movement speed to the position of the gun when held. If held up to aim down sights, players' speed is reduced, and players can only sprint when their gun is lowered. This may sound similar to conventional FPS games, though in practice it's almost the reverse. Rather than clicking a button to sprint which lowers your gun, in Onward, you must first lower your gun and click a button to sprint. Onward also features the ability to snap turn so that players don't need to climb over their headset cables or worry about twisting them. The game also highlights subtle differences in the Vive and Oculus touch controllers. The touch controllers have normal analog sticks, whereas the Vive ones have touchpads. The lowered precision of the Vive touchpads necessitates that the player character move in a digital, 8-directional manner, to avoid players accidentally leaving cover when their inputs are slightly off. There's also room for some more unique and bespoke locomotion mechanics like we find in climbing, where rather than using the sticks to designate a direction to move in, the player actually has to physically run with their hands to move forwards and throw themselves off of objects and climb on them with their hands using the grip buttons. Despite the fact that hardware improvements have negated a lot of the problems with motion sickness, free locomotion will always inherently cause motion sickness for a very small subset of players, but these players are equal customers in the eyes of the headset makers and game developers and need to be catered to as well. Unfortunately, this actually presents a problem to games in the multiplayer scene, where each player needs to have standardized movement mechanics for the game to be fair. There are some interesting solutions out there, like in the game Aspire, where one of the movement options allows the field of view to be reduced when the player is moving, and this tricks the brain into a similar sort of situation where it's like watching a character move on a screen, rather than have your own body move. This option can be turned off in the settings, so the developers providing these different options for different players is great. This could have some use in the multiplayer scene if we can provide separate servers for people that are prone to motion sickness and those that aren't. The problem at the minute is because of the low adoption rate of the VR headsets themselves, game developers can't afford to be segregating their player bases. Obviously there's a variety of different choices that need to be made in VR game development, whether the game requires teleporting mechanics, manual teleporting, free locomotion, and even then what sort of free locomotion depending on hardware differences or the genre of your game. All these things need to be considered, and that makes getting the right locomotion system very difficult. With VR being a new frontier in gaming, there are a variety of different groups of people trying to figure out brand new ways to handle locomotion. Crytek Studio actually do have quite a good amount of input on this. They put up some resources on YouTube for a variety of different locomotion methods that they have thought up, and many of these methods are completely redundant and useless. But what you have to remember is that in the VR scene, a lot of the games and a lot of the boundaries are being pushed by small, independent studios that don't have time and resources to test and create new locomotion methods themselves. So having these resources provided by Crytek is invaluable. Although a lot of these techniques actually might look bizarre and uncomfortable, like this particular nodding acceleration one, if Crytek actually stumble upon even one good new locomotion idea, it will probably be worthwhile. It's also worth mentioning omnidirectional treadmills, since a few companies are trying to make these for use in VR. I don't ever feel that these will be practical for home use, for 3 reasons. 1, they'll always be too expensive. They're going to be luxury peripherals for a very small subset of players, kind of like force feedback wheels are, but probably worse. 2, they will always be too big, especially if companies that make them want to minimise their liability by including harnesses for the players to use. And 3, they will always require too much effort from most players. If you're like me and you have to clear things out of your VR play space every time you want to use it, additionally dragging in a treadmill and getting hooked into it is going to take a lot of time and effort. When you're playing in VR, you also might need to actually leave the headset to go to your keyboard and mouse sometimes, and that's going to be extra difficult if you're locked into a harness. Omnidirectional treadmills also provide additional problems for game developers as it requires the programming for extra locomotion methods that will inevitably only be used by a few players. I do think the treadmills have their place though. They could be very popular in VR arcades for some niche use cases like physical rehab. I want to take an extra moment to talk about one shining example of the stars aligning, with the game's genre melding so well with the locomotive method used that it feeds unbelievably into the gameplay. And that is Lone Echo and its multiplayer component Echo Arena. Lone Echo is a single-player experience set in a zero-G environment. Your character is a robot unit called Echo 1, and in the first half of the game you are tasked with repairing a space station following a strange anomalous event which knocks out a bunch of the station's hardware. Since the game is set in zero-G, there is no requirement for legs to be included in the movement, instead being deferred entirely to the head and hands which are fully tracked. Players can maneuver around with wrist-mounted boosters and throw themselves off of pieces of the environment, using the boosters for minor corrections. Lone Echo clearly took inspiration from another Oculus title, Mission ISS, which is so intuitive to move around that my dad, who never plays games, had no trouble with it. A pre-existing VR dome was broken by Lone Echo with the inclusion of VR arms. The system used is accurate enough most of the time, but the body's own proprioception doesn't notice mismatch between real life and VR arms, except for at very extreme angles. Ready at Dawn, who are known for making the Order 1886, also made up for the scarcity of hardware buttons on the touch controller by placing buttons on the VR character's wrist and head. And this is magical. Playing with this system made me giddy like a kid again. It isn't the first game that's done it. You actually activate night vision on Onward by clicking a button on the helmet, but the particular implementation in Lone Echo is fantastic. The locomotive system is also fantastically utilised in Echo Arena, a zero-G competitive frisbee game, where players can launch off of one another for a quick speed boost. Naturally, these movement mechanics are not translatable into other genres when gravity is involved, but with enough dedication to matching a game's locomotion type to its genre and core gameplay, games like Lone Echo and Echo Arena can be made. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe, and drop a comment below about where you think the future of VR locomotion is going. I'll see you guys in the next one.